Okay, hi everyone. I want to do a review on the whole material that we covered this semester, and I'm going to do it as follows. So first, let's remind ourselves what are the origins of the macroeconomics, and I remind you the situation in the world. So until 1930s, economists believed that the market can self-regulate itself, and the government intervention is wrong, is actually not desired. That was the philosophy of Adam Smith, who coined it as the invisible hand of the market. But this means that if there is unemployment, the unemployed would be willing to work at a lower wage, and employers could hire more people. So unemployment is something to be resolved by the market without the government. In 1929, however, in the Great Depression, the U.S. economy experienced 25% unemployment. There was no social safety net, so no unemployment benefits, and the wage didn't go down, and millions of people have suffered. So then, people realized that the theory may be wrong, or maybe not suitable for the current situation. And John Maynard Keynes, a renowned economist and also a businessman, argued that the economic system will not reach an equilibrium in full employment by itself. He actually said that the government must interfere, or the central bank has to help the economy to reach the equilibrium with solving the unemployment problem. So basically his theory was based on the aggregate demand. The idea was to aggregate the economy into three markets: the market of goods, the market of money, and the market of foreign exchange. And using the interaction between these three markets, we can actually do an analysis and understand how the government should act. This is very different from the case of microeconomics, where you have numerous markets for every good. Let's continue. Okay, so first, once we want to learn the theory, we have to understand that there are two different types of equilibrium in the markets of goods and services. So first, we have to remember that we discussed two different initial points. We could either be at y equals y full, which is full employment, very desirable, this is what we want to achieve, or we can be in a situation where y is different than y full, and here it actually means that the economy is not in full employment. It can be either in unemployment, which is that we produce less than we can, or we can be in above full employment, which means that we are overproducing. We are hiring people for extra time, extra work, overtime, so we can produce more than full employment. But we want, at the end of the day, to reach full employment. So we learn, once we are in a situation where y is different than full employment, we will understand how we reach back the desired point of full employment. Now, we have several models that allows the y of equilibrium to be different than y full. So in the Keynesian model, we said that the aggregate demand equals the aggregate expenditure. Basically, we describe it as, let's describe the expenditure function or the aggregate demand according to its components. So the first component, the easiest one to analyze, is the investment. I remind you that the investment is the increase of buildings, equipment, and inventory in monetary terms. And it's everything that is produced today and remains for future use or remain for use in future years. We showed that when interest rate went up, that caused investment to decrease. The reason is that the investors normally analyze their investment according to the net present value, and we know that net present value of future streams of income is getting smaller as interest rates rise. Also, it's sometimes, you know, when you have high interest rate, then it's profitable just to put the money in the bank and not invest in buildings, equipment, and inventory. Also, another thing that is not written on this slide is that if investment is dependent on loans, then when interest rate goes up, it means the loans become more expensive, and hence the demand for these loans to finance investment drops. The second component of the expenditure or aggregate demand function that we discussed in our class was consumption. Consumption, we had several models that explains the behavior of the consumption of the consumers. Keynes basically said that the consumption is actually a function of the disposable income. And he meant that every year the consumer decides how much to consume according to that year's disposable income. I remind you that disposable income is Y minus T net. So C equals C0 plus MPC times Y minus T net. And this kind of function actually assumes that even if we have no income, we consume something. That's the C0. And that should not surprise you, because even if we have no income, we have to eat. MPC is actually the marginal propensity to consume, which actually describes how much of every dollar that we earn we decide to consume. And the rest is actually directed into savings. So if MPC is 0.8, for example, it means that for every dollar of income we do, then 80% goes to consumption, which is 80 cents, and 20% goes to his savings, which is 20 cents. So this actually describes the decision of consumption. The problem was that after the World War II, the data that economists have collected did not fit the Keynesian consumption approach. So that actually led other economists to try and describe new ways to describe the behavior of the consumers that would fit the new data. So Irvin Fisher offered two-period model which allows to shift consumption over lifetime. Basically, if Keynes said we always decide according to our current consumption, our current disposable income, Irvin Fisher said that we actually can think that the consumer shifts consumption and over time, and they can actually take loans or return loans or save. So that actually means that there's no direct link between current consumption and current income, but the link is between lifetime consumptions and lifetime income. So the consumer, according to this theory, the consumer maximizes his utilities subject to his budget constraint. The budget constraint is C1 plus C2 over 1 plus R, and Y equals Y1 plus Y2 over 1 plus R. That means that the present value of consumption equals to the present value of income. And notice here that we assume that the consumer lives 2 periods. That's a very simplified assumption to try to understand how shifts in consumptions and income over time can affect consumption. So we have here, we see if this is what affect the interest rate, if this is what affect the consumption, we know now that the interest rate is also a factor in consumption. So in determining consumption, because definitely the consumer will take that into account. Now, Franco Modigliani offered another approach to consumption. He basically said that, listen, consumers really don't like aggressive shifts in consumption. We like to consume every period the same amount. We don't want to be in a situation where today we consume a lot and tomorrow we consume very little, and so on. So the consumption, that Modigliani devised was, the idea was taking all your wealth and income over and just distribute it over your lifetime. That was his idea. So here we have W is the wealth, R is the number of years that are left until retirement, Y is the income, the yearly income. Here it's assumed to be constant. and T is how much time we have until we will die. So the consumption is actually taking the whole lifetime wealth and income and divided by how many years we are expecting to live. Now, Milton Friedman actually took the Modigliani idea and actually offered an even more precise way to look at it, and he devised the permanent income hypothesis. And he said that people face random and temporary changes in their income from year to year. So that means that if you are relying on Modigliani's idea that people want to smooth consumption, then they have to think what happens when they experience a change in their income. So Milton Friedman actually offered a very interesting idea to divide the income into two parts: the permanent income and the transitory income. The permanent income is actually the part of the income that people expect to persist in the future. So that's sort of, you can think about it as the average income. You know what is the average income you should expect. Transitory income is all kind of random, unexpected deviation from the average income. So if you got a bonus that you didn't expect, or if you got a fine that you didn't expect, all these things hurt your income. Or if you were laid off and you didn't expect that, then there's a transitory downward shift in your income. So the idea was that the people consume some proportion of their permanent income, and they do not change their consumptions when transitory income occur. So basically, if you have a bonus, he said, no, you're not going to consume a big part of your bonus. You direct it into savings because you are making the consumption decision according to your permanent income. But if you all of a sudden were laid off, so you will live off these savings, but you will not reduce your income in a very radical way. So that was his idea. And that is the end of the theories that we learned about private consumption. Okay, so now we are going to talk about other parts of the expenditure function, and now we are going to talk about government consumption. So government consumption or government spending is whatever the government decides to spend to provide the government services, and it is determined exogenously by the government. The government can finance its consumption through either taxes or bonds. Bonds are actually loans from the public. The next part of the expenditure function is exports and imports. Exports are actually determined by the real exchange rate. So when the prices of goods abroad relative to the prices here are going up, then export will increase. Import is actually determined by two things. It's the local demand of foreign product. We assume that it changes when real exchange rate changes, and it also changes with income, right? Because when income goes up, the demand for foreign goods increase. So that's why income is also related to imports, but not to exports, because exports are something that are not part of our economy's income in the sense of the demand, how much people want to export. It's not related. The export is actually sensitive to the real exchange rate. If we add all the parts of the expenditure function, here is actually the closed form version where you have only the private consumption, the government consumption, and the investment. That's equal the aggregate expenditure. So that actually tells you what is the demand from our product in a closed economy, and in equilibrium the demand of our product should be equal to the supply of our product. Now, a new curve that we learned is the IS curve. IS curve is actually a curve where all the points satisfy income equals expenditure, like the aggregate output the aggregate output should be equal to the aggregate expenditure. Here at the closed form version, it means that y equals c plus g plus I. The IS curve shifts if we are told that one of these component changes, C, G, and I. C may change because a change in tax or in wealth. I may change investment because of investor optimism, for example. But if interest rate changes, that would be a change along the curve. So it's a change that goes like that. From, for lower interest rate, we will have a higher output. Why? Because when interest rate decreases, investment increases, so the demand is bigger and also the supply is bigger. Monetary policy. So in the past, economists thought that the central bank changes the money supply and thus changes the interest rate. However, in the last 30 years, the central bank has a rule by which it determines the interest rate. Taylor recognized this rule. That's why we are using this rule, the Taylor rule. And basically it says that the central bank determines the nominal interest rate, but since the real interest rate is the one that affects investment, and so on, so we translate the rule to the real interest rate terms. And this is the rule. It's a very important rule, which that's why the reason it's so important, that's why I force you to study it by heart. And basically here it goes. So the real interest rate is equal to what? To the target real interest rate, which is what the central bank aimed to get, plus alpha times the difference between the expected inflation and the target inflation. So basically the idea is that the central bank would respond if the expected inflation, which actually also normally equals the actual inflation, whenever you have deviation from the target inflation, the central bank would respond. So if pi e exceeds pi t and or moves up, then R will increase. Basically, the aim of the central bank is actually to keep the inflation at the target rate. So actually, the optimal goal of the bank is that pi e would be equal to pi t. Normally, this is not the case. That is why the interest rate changes all the time. Another component of the Taylor rule and the monetary policy is the component of the GDP gap. GDP gap is a measure that measures how far are we from full employment. So GDP gap is y full minus y over y full. So that gives us some indicator of how far we are from the output of full employment. Because if y equals y full, then the GDP gap would be 0. It means that there is no unemployment. Normally this is not the case. And the central bank normally is very worried when unemployment goes up. So that is why when y full minus y over y full increases, that means the GDP gap increases, then the interest rate would be, the central bank will respond with a lower interest rate to encourage investment and increase demand.